Good evening. I'd invite you all to take your seats, please. Though do feel free throughout the evening to have a cup of tea or coffee and some very nice cookies at the back. I'd like to welcome you to this evening of conversation hosted by the Sexual Exploitation Working Group of Edmonton. We are a leadership group within the city that has been gathering Edmontonians since 2004 to talk about the diversity of experiences of sexual exploitation, impact on individuals and on our communities, on our city. I'd like to introduce some of the members who are here tonight, and we'll start with, I'll just read the names, and if someone is here from one of the groups, I'll ask them just to stand and wave. ACT Alberta, Action Coalition on Human Trafficking. Addiction, Alberta Health Services, Addictions and Mental Health Protection of Sexually Exploited Children. Catholic Social Services, Protection of Sexually Exploited Children Act Community Follow-Up Program. CEASE, Center to End All Sexual Exploitation. City of Edmonton, Citizen Services. Edmonton Police Service, Human Trafficking and Exploitation Unit. And I know that Staff Sergeant Dale Johnson is not here tonight because he is home with his young son. And also, I would like to take the moment to announce, in case you hadn't heard this, but the Edmonton Police Service has taken a bold and courageous step forward and changed the name of Vice Unit to Human Trafficking and Exploitation Unit to better describe the reality of the work and to shift away from that sense of vice and morality. The Edmonton Region Children's Services, Protection of Sexually Exploited Children, Tony. Reach Edmonton Council for Safe Communities, we have Lisa and Brittany. And the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, Metal. And we have Lisa Hardy, and if you could stand up, Lisa, please. Lisa is a therapist with the Sexual Assault Center. And one thing that we have learned and incorporated as a best practice in our educational gatherings is to provide the services of a therapist, because we are talking about very painful experiences. And if someone is triggered or would like a quiet moment with a counselor, Lisa would walk with you and we would have some quiet time outside the room. The Family Center is our last group on the membership, leadership, and I don't think they're here. You are here. Oh, life's embarrassing moments. I am so sorry. Thank you. And could you say your names because I haven't met you yet? Great. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. And I won't make that mistake again. You'll see that some of us are wearing orange or orange ribbons, and you'll see before you orange flowers. We have chosen the color orange because it brings together red, which is fiery and it's anger, but when you combine it with yellow, which is compassion, you bring that all together. So often we need anger at the injustice and the pain that people experience, but if we don't move forward with our hearts, then our actions might be hurtful as well. So we try to bring that color together in orange. It's a color that's been chosen by human trafficking, anti-human trafficking organizations around the world. And so it's the color we've embraced. And I believe it's tonight that our bridge is orange, the high-level bridge. So these flowers are a symbol of all of those who have died as a consequence of sexual exploitation or human trafficking. This includes people who have been murdered. It includes people who have taken their own lives in despair through suicide. It includes people who have been victims of overdose and any complications of addictions and illness. So we feel that it's very important always to remember those in our community who are no longer with us and how they died and why they died, so that we as a community commit to working together in as many ways as possible to create more healing environments so that we do not lose people in these ways. And I'm going to ask Cory to light the candle to help us with this remembrance. Thank you. On your tables, you'll see some little green packages, and I think there's some other green items, pens and elsewhere. This is part of the City of Edmonton's Council Initiative on Urban Isolation and Mental Health. And I think it's really important to remember that isolation and mental health are intrinsically linked to sexual exploitation and other vulnerabilities, and a challenge to us to how we are going to become a caring and inclusive and healthy community. Councillor McKean is going to be our chair tonight, and he is leading this council initiative among several others. And I would like to welcome him to the podium to begin our evening. Thank you.
I wore the wrong Oilers jersey, given that everybody else is wearing orange. Sorry about that. I actually prefer this one, though, because it's not like the one that everybody else is wearing. It is a real privilege to be here, and I want to start by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 6 land, and I like to do that. Mainly because I think it reminds us that we're all attached to that treaty. We are all treaty people, and we all have a responsibility to uplift each other with our kindness and service to each other. As stated, my name is Scott McKean, and I'm the City Councillor for Ward 6 in the City of Edmonton, and you're in Ward 6 right now. It extends from Commonwealth Stadium all the way out to 149th Street and 111th Avenue to the river. So much of Edmonton's vulnerable population is in this ward. And I've learned a lot during this term about our need to come together as a community to deal with those people that, as Kate said, are isolated and isolated in despair. But it's my pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of the Mayor and Council to this event during Edmonton's 2017 Sexual Exploitation, a Week of Awareness. It is a critically important week in Edmonton where we come together to work towards ending sexual exploitation in our community. This event tonight is a powerful one for me because I have always said that in order to end sexual exploitation, we must include men and boys in the conversation. Increasingly, our community is beginning to recognize that understanding the way men are socialized as boys can strategically inform how we prevent sexual exploitation from occurring. Typically, boys are socialized to reject vulnerable feelings and not actually experience them in a healthy way. They are encouraged to hide those feelings in typically masculine scenarios. Think of the number of times we have heard a young man be told to man up or grow a pair when he's openly expressing his thoughts, feelings, or pain. And at this point, I should probably state that I probably shouldn't have worn a hockey jersey to this event. It has driven me more than a little crazy to think of the toxic masculinity on display or portrayed by a certain Don Cherry over the years. And I lament that boys sitting around televisions with their dads hear those messages about what it really means to be a man. Many men are not able to be vulnerable. They struggle to communicate in their relationships, friendships, or romantic, and may seek out intimacy in inappropriate, dysfunctional ways. I'm, of course, referring to porn, now more widely available than ever before, the sex trade, and sexual violence and exploitation. I believe that engaging in these activities is a toxic response to men's socialized disability to feel and express fear, sadness, worry, and embarrassment, just to name a few vulnerable feelings. We are, as humans, social creatures. Studies have shown time and again that we crave and need loving, caring, supportive interactions to live fulfilling lives. But men who suffer the absence of vulnerability struggle to maintain healthy relationships and true intimacy. They are left with, as some call it, a hole in their soul. This is not to say that the acts of sexual exploitation can ever be excused. They can't, and any abuse of a person's rights cannot be tolerated. But as we proceed in our efforts to end sexual exploitation and build healthier communities, I think it's critical that we model healthier masculine behavior, or masculinities, as the folks at Men Edmonton call it, for our children, regardless of where they sit on the gender spectrum. We need to take preventative action to encourage young boys to engage with their own vulnerable feelings and express negativity or anger in healthy ways. We need to support young people so they can find strength in their own identity instead of trying to bend to a masculine gender construct we now know to be outdated, toxic, and self-defeating. And so I will turn to the experts here tonight to expand on a topic of healthy masculinity and preventing sexual exploitation. We are incredibly fortunate to have representatives from Men Edmonton, the Pride Center, the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, the University of Alberta, and the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation. We're also fortunate to have Kate Quinn here, who has quietly and for years led this fight, and it's always with great appreciation that I see you, Kate, and try to acknowledge all the work you've done. Round of applause for Kate Quinn, please. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator, Gianmarco Visconti, who is an Edmonton-based librarian, poet, and radio producer. He is one of the hosts of Adamant Eve, a feminist news program on CJSR, and is a recent graduate of the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta. I warn you, I have to sneak out before the event ends, but at the time I'm here, I look so forward to the conversation. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. Hello, it is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion. I want to take time to thank the Sexual Exploitation Working Group for having me moderate the discussion twice this year. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for being here as well. By seeking out opportunities to educate yourself on issues surrounding sexual violence and exploitation, you are taking the first step in creating the solutions that will keep our pluralistic communities safer and healthier, because education is the foundation of change. So thank you so much for being here. So we're here to talk about how men and masculine folks can leverage their privilege, the privilege afforded them in society, to become advocates for the prevention of sexual violence, and how we can encourage men and masculine folks to develop healthier understandings of gender identity and sexuality. All of our speakers tonight are contributing to these efforts in different and similar ways, and they're each going to share their individual perspective with us tonight. Starting with Justin Audison. Justin has volunteered with Men Edmonton since 2014, where he's been involved in numerous community activities, facilitated workshops, and helped with developing the organizational structure. He also works at Reach Edmonton as a project coordinator on the Reach Immigrant and Refugee Initiative, where he works with men, women, and youth to promote healthy families and reduce family violence through a cross-cultural lens. So please let's welcome Justin to share his perspective on masculinity.
All right, well, thank you for having me tonight. Thank you especially to Kate for putting this wonderful event together. I guess I'll give you guys an overview of what Men Edmonton does. Men Edmonton is a grassroots, volunteer-led organization that works with men and boys to have conversations around masculinity, healthy relationships, and other aspects of what makes what's going to lead to healthier lives for them. So we do that through workshops, through presentations, public engagements such as the Mask You Live In screening that we hosted back on the 1st of April this month, and other opportunities like that where we can try to connect with the community in meaningful ways. And then, sorry, what's next? What's next, sorry? Oh, no, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Next, we're going to hear from Germán Villegas. Germán is a Chilean immigrant who has many years of experience working with youth and youth-related programs. With a background in education, Germán has been a youth worker, school teacher, counselor, and a mental health advocate. Currently, he is the youth coordinator for Men Edmonton and is working with Strathcona County to implement mental health initiatives in schools. Germán also works with the Engaging Men and Boys Project, which helps men and boys dealing with situations of family violence. Germán is also the host of the Modern Man podcast, where he interviews men about manhood and masculinity. Please welcome Germán.
Hello, I'm very happy and proud to be here. Thinking about masculinities and talking about them, and especially speaking about with males and boys in general and with the youth is something that's near and dear to my heart. So I represent two communities. I represent Strathcona County and I represent Men Edmonton, but I also represent the city of Edmonton. So I'm very proud and I'm very happy to be here. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Germán. Next, we're going to hear from Derek Warwick. Derek Warwick is an educator and activist with the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. He is the creator of the Be Your Own Man program, a 15-week violence prevention program for male-identified youth that gives them the skills to build healthy relationships. He holds a BA in Women's Studies from the University of Alberta. Let's welcome Derek.
Thanks, Gianmarco. So I'll keep this brief. Basically, I've been doing this work for about 10 years now, so doing facilitation work with LEAF Edmonton, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, doing work with the City of Edmonton as a contractor, delivering their respectful workplace training, working with the Red Cross with their Healthy Youth Relationships program and their Beyond the Hurt program, which is a bullying prevention program, and most recently with the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, as mentioned by Gianmarco, starting the Be Your Own Man program, which started just in February, and we're right in the middle of our first iteration, so I hope to share lots with you tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. Next, we're going to hear from Lynn Liu. Lynn is the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Pride Center of Edmonton and has worked with various queer youth groups in the past, but has begun to focus more recently on intersections between racial justice and gender justice. Lynn also works with the Brown Boy Project, which works to transform the way that communities of color talk about gender, and in addition to queer-based organizing, has volunteered for the Lieutenant Governor's Circle on Mental Health, Strathcona Community League, and APERC. Let's welcome Lynn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you again the committee for inviting me to be on this panel. I want to talk a bit about my work. So I really enjoy the conversation talking about masculinities. I work with a Pride Center, and the majority of our clients are young trans men. And there's a phrase that I admit I read on Tumblr that I love saying to them. So a lot of the men, they'll define themselves as being a female to male transitioned person. And I always like to remind them that that acronym FTM, remember that it doesn't also mean female to misogynist. Because I think so many times, we talk about gender in being a binary, and that binary can be really limiting, but also that binary can be so affirming, because people who are sorting out who they are, people who want to, assert their identity because they finally found something in words that fit, that sometimes they'll buy in a little too much, and that sometimes they will be very toxic and very hostile with their masculinity, because it's not because in their eyes, it's not about the effect they have on others, but about asserting themselves and being seen as that. So I want us to kind of hold that in our minds and our hearts as we talk about masculinities, and that yes, there is the impact, but maybe how do we help and support these boys and these young men in asserting their masculinity and letting them be seen as masculine people as well.
Thank you, Lynn. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Cory Wyeth. Cory has dedicated his life to working with LGBTQ2 youth and men who have sex with men. He currently leads the Below the Belt initiative, which provides mentoring and sexual health services for men involved in the sex trade. He is also a comprehensive health education worker with the Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services at the University of Alberta. With a background rooted in psychology and social work, Cory strives to be the voice for the underdog, for gender and sexual minority youth, and for queer communities. Let's welcome Cory.
Good evening. Nice to see you all. My name is Cory. I work with one of the most amazing populations we have in the city. And I'm proud to be that voice for those young men and boys that are involved in the sex trade in the city. It's very much a quiet, silent, very underground. Most people don't even know it exists. But I'm here to tell you that it does exist, and in a big way. And those boys need a voice, and they need to tell their stories. So that's why I'm here this evening.
All right, so those are our panelists, and I'm going to quickly move over to the chair there so I'm not standing awkwardly in the corner, so we can begin our panel discussion. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your perspective on this topic. I want to start with a kind of a broad question to sort of clarify the two things that we're talking about, healthy masculinity and preventing sexual exploitation. Because as I was preparing for tonight and thinking about the topics, I was trying to find, I was starting to feel like these are two different processes that we're trying to tackle all at once, but I wanted to get your opinion on this. So this is a question for the whole panel. Do you think that by breaking down gender roles with men and masculine folks, that will naturally lead to less cases of sexual exploitation?
Hello? Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think they're interrelated in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, that masculinity is based off of sexual prowess, and when men don't feel that they fit into that role, they seek that out elsewhere. And the inability to communicate about things, I think, really plays into that. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done beyond changing the culture around masculinity to prevent sexual exploitation. But I think that's a really big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I echo those statements as well. I think it's a bigger piece in the puzzle. Like, I think once we start breaking down those gender roles around, especially around masculinity, a lot of those things start to unbox. And I think it's, like you said, like sexual exploitation is part of that box we need to unbox, but there's a bigger role in that respect. But it does help. It definitely does help, and I don't think it's the one answer as well either. I think there's a lot of different answers, but it's one piece of the puzzle.
You know, Gianmarco, I think another way of phrasing your question is, if there are no men, is there still sexual exploitation?
Yeah, let's answer that question.
Maybe I'll leave that question there.
Oh, is that the one I'm answering now? Yeah, I think when thinking about gender roles, I think a lot of times we think gender roles and then our minds will jump to male and female, masculinity and femininity. And I think one thing to think about when talking about sexual violence, especially intimate partner violence, is when people have queer couples or queer relationships, a lot of times people are like, well, who's being the man in that relationship? And that doesn't happen, right? It's touched on earlier that these are relationships about power, right? And I think masculinity is a vehicle for power and a vehicle to not feel powerless anymore. So in my bio, it's a bit about how I like to talk about gender justice and racial justice. And when you think about these things in a larger structural scale, if you are a racial minority, you are on the bottom of those social ladders. But if you're a man, you're also on the top. So like I've seen patterns of toxic and hypermasculinity more exaggerated in men of color because masculinity is a way to escape the racism that they face. So I think really, so with that, I think these things are absolutely interrelated, and that the reflexivity we have in our roles and the complexities of our identities will allow us to get to more honest answers about things.
And just to kind of touch base on what my colleagues were saying too, it's those roles and those definitions of masculinity really need to change. They are outdated. We've moved beyond that in so many different ways. And men, and especially young boys, are subjected to how that's defined through social media, how that's defined through music videos, magazines, all those sorts of things. And we know that can become very, very toxic. So I think it's time that we moved beyond just defining those as they once were.
So we need to approach them as if they are interrelated. I agree. So my next question is for Justin and Germán, because you both work with youth and adult populations. So I'm wondering, are there challenges to having critical conversations about gender with youth versus with adults?
Yeah, I think a big challenge with having these conversations is how we come about them. So I know in the past when I've had these conversations using kind of a deficit-based approach, people kind of shut down. But there are ways to do it in a way that is strength-based kind of, and where you're kind of working with the people's strengths that they have to help them kind of come to realizations on their own. However, there's always a challenge of getting people in the door. So it's finding ways to get to where men and boys are already meeting and find ways to integrate these conversations into the day-to-day conversations they're already having, and find ways to integrate lessons around masculinity and gender relations and things like that into their day-to-day conversations.
Yeah, and I think that specifically for young males, they need a hand to do this. Like, I think for them, you know, like when we talk about masculinity, there's a lot of talk about the man box and what you're talking about, Cory, like those outdated versions of what masculinity is. But there's always these definitely roles that genders just try to step into. But I think specifically for young males that they need a hand to break out of that. They can't do that by themselves. And I think sometimes that can go along with adults too. Like, I feel that those things need to be echoed too. I think adult males still need that hand too. And I think they don't need to do it in a very calling out way. I think they need to be brought together like hand by hand. And I think those two things are similar, I found. Like, I work a lot with adult males who were, perpetrators of domestic violence, and I co-facilitate some groups around that, and they, those men are hurt as well too. And I think finding that kind of empathy as well, even though they've caused violence and they know they've caused violence, there's still a form that they have also hurt too. So yeah.
That actually leads into my next question. It kind of goes back to Derek's comment. Is it difficult to introduce the concept of accountability when you're, and to acknowledge that men are most often the perpetrators of violence. How do you work through that with men?
Well, I mean, this is direct to me.
Yeah, it's both of you. Yeah, both you and Justin.
I mean, the accountability pieces, I think they come in time, and I think they specifically when I speak about adult males, they're like with young males, it's a little bit harder because like their critical thinking skills are they're still maturing and they're still adapting. But for adult males, I think that accountability piece will come with a lot of therapy and a lot of work and a lot of talking and a lot of trying to unpack these raw emotions that they've had of either missing fathers or missing adult mentors or just missing relationships. But the accountability, we still need to keep those people accountable of their actions. And even doing the work that I do, I need to be aware that these people have done these either violent or exploitative things. So yeah, I mean, that accountability piece is super important, but again, I think it comes with time. Yeah.
Justin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've just recently I've noticed with everyone on social media how that can play such a role in these conversations, and how what used to be kind of more private platforms are more public. And a lot of times when these kind of things unfold on social media, there's a person who is called out publicly in front of their peer groups and peer groups of their peer groups. And I think that can be damaging when we push people away by calling them out almost, and having these conversations without the person involved in the conversation itself. So I think there's something to be said about how we're holding people accountable and what consistency we have in how we're doing that. I absolutely think accountability is crucial to this conversation, because without it, there's no resolve. But we have to do it in a way that doesn't alienate the other.
Right.
Yeah.
So you think we should work through accountability in more private spaces, or calling in? I like that phrase.
Yeah,
calling.
yeah, privately calling in, bringing, because people want to grow.
Right.
At their root, most people hopefully want to grow. So it's helping them find a way to grow to being accountable for what they've done, and hopefully being a better person going forward.
My next question is for Derek. I was wondering if you could talk about the specific skills or exercises that you go through when you're running your Be Your Own Man program.
Sure. So in Be Your Own Man, we're actually using the Canadian Red Cross's Healthy Youth Relationships curriculum, which is a research-informed, new-ish curriculum. It was just revised about 1.5 years ago, and I had been working with it for a few years before then. With the new version of it, the updated version, it has about 15 different lessons, and some of them include just discussing what is a healthy relationship, moving on to communication skills and conflict resolution skills, and then taking an in-depth look at the different types of relationship violence. And so in terms of skills, I'd say the major ones are focusing on using assertive communication when we're talking with people, and conflict resolution. And something that's really been eye-opening for me is, this is my first time working with youth on a long-term basis. I've worked with youth for a long time, but it's always been one-time workshops. And so being able to really see what challenges these youth and being able to see what changes over time is really exciting to me. But one thing that I noticed recently when talking about conflict management is I would give them a scenario. So, for example, a simple scenario would be your partner insists that they look at your text messages, is one example. And the youth would, of course, at times make joke responses, but sometimes they would give a response that was so off from what I was looking for, I would have to wonder if they were joking or that was their serious answer. And I think often that was their real answer, that they would get angry or they would tell the person to F off, or because I think we take for granted the conflict management skills that we have. And so I think coming back to what Herman was saying, that I think youth, they do need us to help them along to build these skills, to build this knowledge. And if I had to name 2 skills, it's conflict resolution, but also empathy building, learning to really empathize with others. And I think because I'm in the role of violence prevention, especially women or women-identified people.
So would you like to see programs like that expand and be more integrated into society? Or do you hope that your kids will be able to become educators once they finish your program?
Right, so I think the ideal thing is for programs like this to be used across the province, across the country. Funding is a real big issue for that to happen. There will be a mentorship component where the youth who finish the program will be able to be mentors to future youth who go through the program. I'm still working out exactly what that looks like, but that's definitely a focus.
Mm-hmm. My next question is for Cory. I think your background is very interesting because you're dealing with men who are vulnerable and subject to violence and exploitation. And you kind of talked about this briefly in your introduction, but I was wondering if you think there's enough support for men in the sex trade currently.
No. And the reason being is because it's very much a very deep underground community. It's a subculture of the queer community. And there's no strip anywhere, there's no street where they all hang out. Most of it is online. And it's very hard to navigate that to even do some outreach and stuff. And so we have an outreach center, which is very busy and working really, really well on Jasper Avenue. But there's definitely not even enough resources or research or any sort of things being done for those boys and men in the trade. And we're finding their masculinities are really fractured, and they're fractured from many things from coming out. But once they're in the trade, or many of them start just because it's survival sex, they use it because they have to survive. And so there's no real resources. We have the wonderful Pride Center and myself, and that's give or take a few little bits here and there. That's pretty much it. And there's only really 2 of us. and limited by hours. I have 15 hours a week to do that work. And so a lot of the men and boys fall through the cracks, right? And but one of the most powerful forces with that is, as a resource, is mentoring. Being able to do one-to-one with those guys and be like, hey, let's go do some healthy stuff. Let's go grocery shopping as guys. Let's go for coffee as guys. They don't get to do those really healthy relationships as far as being just guys. And so I work a lot with doing that sort of stuff as well. And even providing opportunities for them. We have a bursary program that one individual has accessed and is now going back to school. Would have never had that if it weren't for these small bits of resources that we can find. And it's the formula is really simple with those guys. They just need that support. They need that understanding and to be in that space where they're at. And there's definitely not enough resources pointed that way.
It's almost as if even the struggles of these men are underground, even within the queer community itself. So how would you what do you envision for the future? Like what resources would you like to be made available that aren't currently there?
I think the ability to do that work more, like beyond just 15 hours or beyond the limited space that Lynn has and stuff, would be great. And unfortunately, it comes down to funding, as always. But I know there's some very passionate people, and I'm starting to see as those stories get out, and that's one thing I really want to try this year is to get those stories out so that people hear and acknowledge that those boys and men do exist, that they are sexually exploited. And because I think traditionally, we've never seen men in that trade the way we see female members or trans members of that trade, right? So I think the future would be to tell those stories even more.
My next question is for Lynn. It's sort of related. I'm wondering if you see people who are masculine of center as another vulnerable population in this discussion of healthy masculinity?
I would say it's an interesting thing because a lot of times, especially with youth, like I was mentioning before, they will go to very binary expressions of their gender. So if they are masculine of center or feel like they are masculine of center or non-binary, they feel like that's not valid, that they don't get to be members of the trans community or the queer community because they're not trans enough, right? And I think it is these understandings we have of masculinity and gender that says you need to have this amount, you need to have this amount of testosterone in your body, or you need to look in these ways. And I think that by having very rigid and very static definitions and how we define masculinity, whether it be from media, social media, or from our own peers, right? I think having a lack of role models and people who are shown and displayed of having healthy relationships with themselves and their bodies and their masculinity, and that masculine of center people do exist. I think not being able to see that is really, really challenges individuals. I kind of want to talk a bit about the Queer Women in Trans Festival a bit, because there's a film which I think would be really interesting for some folks here. This happens to be on Father's Day too, which was a complete accident, but I think really enjoyable, is that we have a film, and it's called, I think, A Womb of Their Own. And it's about butch women and trans men who give birth, and how birth giving is not seen as feminine. It doesn't define them as women, but it's something that their body does and that they want to do. And I think having especially trans men go through that experience and being like, yeah, I gave birth, and it doesn't devalue me as a man or my manhood. And I think, A, hearing of that story, and B, having those people in community diversify the types of masculinity we have.
Mm-hmm. So with your work with the Brown Boy Project, would you like to encourage masculine of center people to become responsible for people who are feminine of center, or are the power dynamics different?
Okay, so I think I understand this question, saying like
Sorry,
the relationship.
It's hard to articulate.
It is, but I think you're kind of asking to like pick a little more about the relationship between people who are masculine of center and feminine of center.
Yeah, because you talked about how sometimes people who are trans or non-binary can embody an exaggerated form of gender expression.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that, of course, with talking about masculinity, the first step is accepting it in ourselves. And being able to have that reflexive lens, we can see how we've internalized things. Because as much as we talk about our own masculinity, our own identities don't exist in a bubble. It exists in the world where there's society and structures and there's norms. And it is a norm that if you are read as male, if you can pass, or if you're masculine, you will have more power in society. So then Brown Boys, it challenges us, encourages us, the Brown Boy Project, encourages us to think about, okay, one, accepting and understanding our own masculinity and not replicating the toxic parts that we don't want to see in the world, but then how do we then use that power and privilege we have as men, masculine of center people, or butch women, and how do we use that to support and protect the femmes and women in our lives? Because I think that's the next part, is after we have found that personal journey for ourselves, it's then realizing we're also part of a community. And in so many times, women and femme deal with our emotional labor, and they take care of us when we can't take care of ourselves. And how do we honor and protect that instead of just continuing to use that and then moving on without giving back to them?
So what kinds of initiatives would you like to see to support masculine of center people of color in the city?
I think a lot of conversation within queer communities is a lot of organizing is around the specific LGBTQ2S identities, but none of them have that really intersectional or that cross-sectional lens about your racial identity or your ethnocultural background, because your definitions of gender are different across cultures. And there's been some talk and organizing about creating groups for QT BIPOC people to organize. And I think really seeing that flourish and grow and having something really robust stay, right? I think the first step is carving out spaces for ourselves. And then as a community, having spaces, what do we want next?
So I want to shift gears a little bit and throw another question to the whole panel. I'm wondering, when we're talking about healthy masculinity specifically, do we need to be careful about creating new gender roles by accident?
Okay, I guess I'll start
Yeah,
because I have
sure.
the microphone. I think I want to elaborate more on new gender roles. So what do you mean by that?
So are we, even if we're talking about healthy ways to express masculinity, is there a danger of imposing another model of this is how a man should act? Even if it's saying a man expresses his emotions, we're still treating gender as something that you have to perform correctly. And should we be instead opening it up for people to, treat gender as an identity and not something that you do for others?
Okay, yeah, I think, yeah, that is a tough one, and that's definitely one that I see with
It's a meaty question. So.
Oh, no, it's a good question, because I think a lot of that comes with like that individual work with people to get them being comfortable with their authentic selves, right? I think a large part of the Brown Boy Project, a large piece of the Brown Boy Project has taught me is that you need to be self-reflexive to an extent. You need to be reflexive and understand yourself, and living your authentic life and living what masculinity means to you in authentic ways is what allows you to be healthy, right? And I think that's a trend and a pattern I see with a lot of the trans youth I work with, is that they're trying to find means and ways to authenticity. And I think that authenticity and supporting that learning process, supporting those mistakes, is really, really important. Touching back on what Herman and Justin were saying about calling in instead of calling in instead of calling out. And I like to add a dimension to that people will always make mistakes. If we don't make mistakes, we won't grow. I know that the times I've grown the most is from having really, really major like F-ups in my life, right? I had to correct myself. I almost said a bad word there. Yeah. And that, I think adding a dimension to that is that, a lot of people think if they make a mistake, they're not allowed in community. And I think having delineations that there's being a leader and that there's existing in community, and giving people space to exist in community without saying you also have to be a leader, you also have to be the best and teach others and a mentor. I think sometimes people are allowed just to be and just exist in community. Yeah.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
So there's a prominent doctor in England. His name is Joseph Gelfer, and he talks a lot about the 5 stages of masculinity. And what his progression of masculinity involves is one of them is going through the stages. And the 3rd stage is a critical masculinity, which I feel is a lot of where we're at, actually criticizing what those gender roles are. And those stage 4 is called multiple masculinities, which we kind of accept that there's a lot of different types of masculinities, which you were talking about. And I think that is important to actually understand and actually try to exist, because I really do agree that there is a danger in creating new gender roles. I've heard from somebody that said, like, I'm worried that we're stepping from one man box to another. And that's a worry for some people. And I think it's also important to actually criticize sometimes and look at it as a very conflicting and critique role of sometimes that kind of policing. For example, there's a rapper, his name is Young Thug, and he, on his cover of his album, he's wearing a dress and he's wearing a very feminine pose. And people applauded him for that, and they said, you know what, this is a new expression of masculinity, this is something that's really exciting and cool. But then you look at his lyrics and they're very misogynistic and they're very sexist. So people kind of move past that and they're like, no, but he's, it's a little different because he's just wearing a dress. But I'm like, there's still a form of critique there. And I think people kind of forget that and they just kind of assume that this is a new form. I think there should be a space where we can critique those roles as well, and to move past that and to kind of just be comfortable with yourself. And be comfortable in a healthy way of doing it. And I think there is a time to say, like, well, if you're doing something unhealthy, then we can critique that, but not critique it as you not being a man. You're just not being a good person.
I think anytime we're prescribing a certain way to be, I think we ought to be cautious about that. And I think, there are elements of so-called toxic masculinity that I think can be still a part of like a society in which we treat other people with kindness and care, and we don't hurt or assault other people. I think men will. Some men will enjoy expressing themselves in violent ways, and I think something like that is okay as long as they're not harming someone else. You know, if UFC is your thing, go for it, right? Just don't harm people who aren't a part of that. Yeah, I don't know that a new masculinity is even the solution. I think we ought to question some of the attitudes or behaviors that men and boys use a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're creating a new kind of masculinity. When I'm working with boys, because masculinity and working specifically with boys isn't a part of the healthy youth relationships curriculum, I often like to ask them, well, okay, so what does this mean for boys? Boys were told not to express feelings except for perhaps happiness and anger or frustration. So what does it mean for us when we share those feelings? And it's not that we're expressing a different kind of masculinity. I think it's more that we're opening up masculinity.
Definitely, I totally agree with that too. And part of it too is maybe being a little more fluid with those definitions so that we're not just put into one, but allowing especially young boys to explore, like you just said, what does that mean to be a man? What does that mean to have that masculinity and all those sorts of things? We talk a lot about fluidity and gender fluidity in our sexual orientation, those sorts of things. And I think the same model might be good to apply to those gender roles and to masculinity.
Yeah, actually, I was at a presentation recently, and this question kind of came up to the presenter. They phrased it differently. They said, the way they put it was, when we're taking men out of the man box, are we worried about putting them in another box? Right. And I think the big thing that we're trying to do is remove any box. Yeah. And speaking exactly what Cory said, and everyone on the panel has already mentioned, is that we all have components of masculinity and femininity within us. And it's understanding that, knowing that if you like certain things, that's okay. It's okay to be in the middle or be further this way or that way, as long as you're not impacting other people and hurting people because of it.
So when I know, Justin, you do workshops on emotional intelligence. So when you're talking about those kinds of things, does gender really factor into it, or is it just do you frame it as just a way of being healthy?
Well, I think with emotional intelligence, especially with men, we're given strict definitions of what our emotions look like. So we're given angry, sad, happy, or surprised. And looking beyond that and thinking of the depth in those emotions is really an empowering thing that men can do, especially if it's something that they're not used to doing. And it can give you a way of like actually kind of improving your relationship with yourself and understanding your own emotional management. So I have three things that I harp on. It's emotional intelligence, so understanding yourself. Social intelligence, so relating to other people and using your emotional intelligence and understanding that they also have that full spectrum of emotions. And then empathy, so being able to relate with other people and understand, maybe you haven't gone through what they've gone through, but know that what they've gone through is impactful. And the core to that is kind of giving that empowerment of understanding your own emotions, having voice for that, and understanding how to respond to your own personal triggers.
All right. So I want to now talk about culture shift. I guess I feel like a phrase that gets thrown out a lot when we're talking about masculinities. How do we shift our culture? And that makes me think about how do we change collectively as a community. And something I think about whenever I'm participating in a social justice effort is whether or not I put myself in this, where I only surround myself with people who think like me. So I'm wondering if what you guys think about how can we reach the men who really need this education on emotional intelligence and violence prevention, or So how do we reach men who maybe haven't thought about these things before?
I think definitely the part of, I think empathy needs to go both ways. And I think we talk a lot about asking for empathy for marginalized populations, and they are people who deserve empathy. But we also need to be empathetic for the people that want to learn and want to actually do the work that is able to be, to do this kind of work, or to just be more informed. I echo what Justin was saying, that there's a lot of this call-out culture, and it just pushes people away. I think we divide each other way too much beyond that, and I think we need to start pulling people in. I truly believe the majority of people are people that want to know and want to be good and want to be people that want to do the right thing, but they just don't know how to ask the right question. I work in schools, and I had many teachers ask to me, one teacher was asking me about indigenous rights, and he said to me it's an interesting phrase. He said, I want to be able to ask the questions without feeling judged, without feeling like I am the bad guy. And I think we really need to work on that. I say this to me personally, and then I say it, go to many places where people are just pointing fingers. But I think we need to start grabbing that hand and taking them in and actually having that conversation without giving them judgment. And I think it's going to reach more and more people and getting outside of this echo chamber, because we're going to get a lot more different types of views and a lot of different types of ideas, and definitely more questions. And we're going to be challenged more. But yeah, that's my view.
And then, with how do we get this out to people? I think it's really a marketing kind of problem. We have to look at where people are, especially men. They're in the workplace, they're in the community, but I do that too, where I surround myself with people that are like-minded and think the same way as me, and then I think, oh, everyone's like this. And then I go out on the street and I realize, oh wait, no, okay. It's finding ways though to integrate these kinds of lessons into workplaces. So, and looking at it not as a thing that's gonna be burdenous on the workplace, but beneficial. So having kind of empathy training in the workplace is gonna lead to fewer accidents because people are less afraid to ask for help. Finding ways to market these as kind of leadership building or character building, with the results actually working into their home lives as well. Finding ways to meet men where they're at is such a cliche thing that we say all the time, but it's crucial. It's something that we have to be very cognitive of and something that we need to put forth in everything we do.
Gianmarco, I just want the question fresh in my head. Can you read it again?
Yeah, so how can we reach men who already don't have social justice tendencies, I guess, who haven't thought about these things before? How do we reach out of our echo chamber?
Yeah, thanks. Okay. So there's lots of good data on this, and I think specifically about the work done by Shift. They're a Calgary organization. They do some great research in this area. I highly recommend reading those. There's a couple of reports that they've done that have been very useful to me. But we know, for example, that the majority of work done that targets boys, that's my focus area, largely reaches white middle-class boys. So boys who are doing well, they have lots of access to resources. Not enough is done to reach boys of color or boys in rural areas. That's a tremendous gap there. So again, I come back to funding. We need these projects to be funded. But also, we need to take that effort to reach out to these boys. When I work with schools, because I've worked with schools for a number of years, and sometimes I go to a very diverse school, diverse in many ways, not only ethnically or based on race, but I would sometimes go to this diverse school, and they have selected a group of students for this training that I'm offering, and it's all white students. And so we need to be very specific when we're getting staff or people in the community to do the recruitment, that we want a group of people, of students, whatever group you're working with, that represents or reflects the diversity of that community or that school. So I think that's really clear. That needs to be a part of the conversation from the start. And yeah, I think too we need to reach boys who are struggling. I'm currently in talks with an organization that works with incarcerated youth. So I have hopes that we'll learn some great things from working with those boys. Either that this program is amazing, it works really well for this group of boys, or that it's a failure and that this program does not work as a remedial program, which is my suspicion. But until we deliver the program and evaluate it, we don't know. Yeah, so that's a bit of that. There's been talk of this call-out culture too, which I hope we have more time to talk about. I'm very skeptical of criticisms of call-out culture, because I think it originates with people of color and women who get harassed or mistreated and nothing is done about it. So I think it can be useful. I think there's a time to call people in with gentleness and fairness, but I think that there are uses for both strategies, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think when talking about echo chambers, or dealing with people that you don't like, who here is, okay, so I'm gonna ask
That's a
everyone
good way to
this
put
one.
it, basically.
Yeah,
I was trying to be diplomatic.
So who here on Facebook has seen someone on their Facebook feed say something unsavory they disagree with, and they just blocked them or unfriended them? Yeah. Some people do that, and that's totally valid. That's totally fair to be like, I do not have the emotional labor to do that. Because I'm also noticing the most people who raised their hands were femmes, right? And again, going back to how femmes and women of color are asked to do that emotional labor, a friend of mine has this phrase which makes me giggle, but is completely true. It's like, collect your people. It's just like, if you have gone through experiences or struggled with this, if someone who looks like them or sounds like them, has similar life experiences, says, this is hard, it sucks, but I've done this and here's how, let me coach you through it, that is way more effective than someone who doesn't look or sound like them or doesn't have the lived experiences like them, right? So I think, reaching out to your own peers and going to people in your circles and being like, hey, I notice this is hard for you. Do you want to get coffee and talk about that? I think that's absolutely a way to do it, and especially encouraging men to do that. It touches on what you were saying, Cory, about having healthy relationships with other men, and that going on coffee with someone doesn't always mean it's a date. It could just be friends going for coffee. And I think, thinking back with the youth that I work with, going on a friend's date for coffee, some of them are like baffled by that. When I say I'm going to coffee, they're like, oh, is that a date? I'm like, no. It's not. Like, learning how to have healthy, dynamic relationships with people, I think, will also allow us to reach out to people and I don't want to say prevent that echo chamber, but be able to have difficult conversations. Because I think an echo chamber, it's one part being around people who think like you, but it's also self-selecting out. And sometimes we can't because of emotional labor, our jobs are taxing, or we're always being asked in our lives to do that. But I think also thinking, it's like, if I'm self-selecting out, I'm also closing that door, right? Yeah, another thing that you were mentioning, Justin, was about empathy as leadership, right? And talking about that. And I think that's really great to get people who are motivated and people who want to do that. But I also caution against that, because by saying that empathy is leadership, it's very individual. It's by saying that, if I want to be a leader, I'm going to take care of my community. And how I envision, I hope for community, is that we all take care of each other, is that we all can't, no one of us can move forward unless we're all holding each other and we're all supporting each other, right? Going back to the elements about call in versus call out, I think one thing about call out culture, which is why it's so scary, is that ostracization. And I think that you can call out a negative behavior as long as there's still space for them in community and they can still exist and have relationships with people.
I think the other really important piece too is to remember that to challenge ourselves to be good role models for those young men especially. I have a 10-year-old son, and I find myself all the time correcting myself trying to make it seem like it's really okay for him to be himself, until recently when he kissed this girl that's 2 years older than him. Then I struggle. However, but I still try and create those healthy images, and that it's okay to cry. It's okay to, come cuddle me while we watch a movie. It's okay to do those things. And it's funny because even when we hang out with his friends, I try and be that role model all the time for them. And it's amazing what an effect that has. So it's a good challenge to challenge, my bromances or my best friends and all that to do the same thing. And because we are role models for those individuals.
So building off of the idea of creating bridges between people who don't necessarily agree with each other, Cory and Lynn, I'm wondering, would you like there to be more collaborations between LGBTQ groups and non-LGBTQ groups when it comes to addressing the violence within our own communities?
I think absolutely. There's so much work to be done. We can't do it individual. And I know at the Pride Center, our motto for work is, why would we duplicate something someone already does? What we do is we go and support their staff and their volunteer team, and how do we educate and support them into kind of challenging that very gendered thinking or assumption-based thinking, assuming that people are cisgender or heterosexual, right? And so, yeah, I absolutely think collaboration is absolutely key. And with collaboration, a lot of times the word being an ally is thrown around. And I really want to stress the importance of allyship, not being an ally. Because by being an ally, people think, oh, I've done my one good deed of the week. That's all I've done. And I think with all of this, whether it's about masculinity or supporting queer youth or trans youth, all of this is active. All of us wanting to do these things is active in bettering ourselves and bettering our community. And I challenge us to use the word allyship because it's a verb and it's much more dynamic.
It's a great word. The other thing, too, is to really look at those relationships between queer men and men that I may identify just as straight or heterosexual, because those relationships are so fractured and damaged. We still see a lot of hate crimes. We see guys driving down the street in a vehicle hollering fag out the window, those sorts of things. And so it's important to acknowledge those and to really struggle and try to work on those relationships so that there's some sort of understanding.
Do you see those kinds of organizational partnerships happening in Edmonton, like between the Pride Center and government organizations, for example?
Yeah, I think, I admit I will have a biased lens because I'm in the Pride Center, and we are striving for more collaboration and partnership. But I think a good indicator is the number of people reaching out to us, either through word of mouth or just wanting, or management taking an approach of being like, hey, we want to do this and we don't know how. So I definitely see that there is partnership happening, but of course it's limited by having a small staff team and capacity and funding, and just not having enough time in the day.
Cory, do you feel there's a need for partnership with Below the Belt and other organizations?
Absolutely. Again, it comes down to having a voice for those men and telling people, letting them know that there's that scene out there, that there is a lot of young boys, there's a lot of men engaged in the sex trade in the city. And having those frank conversations, and I love it because usually after we do a presentation, I get rushed with all these people that are like, can't believe that there's such things go on, or want more information, or need to know especially about survival sex, right? And so the more especially Below the Belt can get out there and start educating and having that voice, I think we're going to come to a bit of a better understanding of that population.
So this idea of needing support and funding and outreach has come out a lot. So a question for Derek, Justin, and Germán. How would you encourage people to advocate for that or to lend support, like to bring a workshop to their workplace, or for example, or to go out to a rural community? How can people either support that or participate in those kinds of things?
Actually, since I work out of South Dakota County, I work in a lot of some rural communities. I work mainly out of Sherwood Park, but I do a grant called Engaging Men and Boys, and it does revolve many similar things that Derek does as well, to talking about healthy relationships, and it runs through a specific model called the 4th R, and but it works through, I try to work in a little bit more of a gender basis to it, especially for males. But the one challenge that I have always is trying to get people to buy into the program. And the one way I was able to do it was to bridge the two things between academics, leadership, and truancy, really, to be honest. Like, are these people getting in trouble? They're not, they're getting less in trouble now because of this program. So that's the, and I was able to reach out to the parents and to the teachers and say, look, if you do this, not only is your male population going to benefit, but your female population is going to benefit, and your teachers are going to benefit, and your parents are going to benefit. It's a very encompassing thing. And once they see that kind of change, and it could be just a little thing, like so-and-so is not coming to the office, not any more often, or so-and-so is actually identifying that they are stressed out or they're anxious. And they see these little changes, and all of a sudden they're like, it clicks. They're like, yeah, it's that. Or I usually go for sports teams, for instance. Like, I did a presentation once to a volleyball team and a basketball team in a specific school. I did something like very easy presentation about the man box and what language does, and all of them just kind of like, whoa, like that was, like I get it, like I'm not supposed to say the word bitch or the word faggot, like it's very demoralizing. And they, once they understood that, they immediately bought in. Obviously, there's some people that don't, and there's people that will still struggle with that, but. And then they understand that there's once that empathy comes in, there's just in general their whole persona is benefits from it. But yeah, just tying it into other things that they really latch into, like academics or like truancy rate or like less suspension or anything like that. I think tying to things that they know, I think works really well.
So the question was around how to support...
Yeah, like a program like Riri, for example.
Yeah, well, we work with Cory for Riri. But I think they're with, so obviously collaboration, but collaboration that is kind of mainstream, kind of, I hate that word mainstream, but
Yeah,
like
I know.
Organizations that serve men kind of taking the back seat and letting others lead in those kind of areas of support where they can support them and let them kind of, those groups kind of have that, or help give them power, I guess, or I don't know how else to describe it. I think just talking about it more openly too. A lot of times when, with youth specifically, conversations around LGBTQ issues are kind of hushed, and I think that's damaging to the people that are having them, because it's not something, then the kids in the community kind of also see it as something that shouldn't be talked about, or they should feel ashamed about if they have those kinds of identities. But through conversation and like Cory will know, through talking to people and having conversations and going to dinner at people's houses and introducing subjects slowly and understanding that they're coming from, especially on the Riri Project, we work with immigrant and refugee populations, and a specific portion of that is working with families while they're working with their children who are discovering their gender and sexual identities. So a lot of times in those communities, it's challenging to have those conversations because it's something that they haven't had the luxury of having that conversation before. And having somebody like Cory who speaks so openly and honestly and kindly and kind of walking the families through that time is so valuable. So bringing those stories to the forefront, I think, are really important.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Oh, maybe I'll ask it more like specifically to Be Your Own Man. So you mentioned funding as an issue for it to expand and be more integrated. Is there a way that people can help fund it or help support it? Like, basically.
I mean, that's a question to answer next year when we apply for funding.
I guess.
Yeah, you know, Yeah, maybe we'll move on to the next question.
Okay, sorry. I think we're about ready to get some questions from the audience, but before we do, I just want to touch base with each of you, and I am wondering if you could say, where would you like to see more advocacy from men and masculine folks when it comes to preventing sexual exploitation?
I'll start. Okay, so I guess this is the time when my inner cynic gets to come out. So I think we need to start, as I'm sure you can guess, I'm going to say based on my work, we need to start with boys. We need to give them not just awareness, and I think that's been a big focus since the late 80s, 90s, when the White Ribbon Campaign started. It was all about awareness, right? We are past that. We need to move beyond awareness. We need to give boys and men skills to address these problems. And as Lynn was saying, right, we need to encourage them to practice allyship and look at what that looks like. What does it mean to practice allyship day in, day out, specifically in the area of violence prevention? I think actually our community has a lot to do with getting men to do this work, and I think I think we need competent men doing this work. I'd like to really point out the work of Tuval Dinner. Parker LaFleur isn't currently working in this field, but I think once he finishes school, he's going to be just a great asset to this community. I think Nathan Forger has some great insight into some good work in this area. So I think really elevating the people who are doing good work in the community and don't always get invited to these sorts of things. I think of Joseph Lurie, who I don't know him very well personally, but from what I understand from the community, he does some really excellent work. So I think we need to take a look at making sure that other people are getting an opportunity to share their expertise and their knowledge and their skills. And I think as a community, we also need to be cautious, and this is something I've experienced for the last 10 years, especially when I was starting out. We ought to be cautious of I think, really raising men on pedestals who when we happen to say the right things, because saying the right things is easy. We need to take a look at the actual work being done. Yeah, I think, I guess just related to that, I think, we ought to be, I think, skeptical of men who also want to get into this area. I, including myself, I wish people had been more skeptical of me because, you don't know someone's intentions going into this work. There are great examples, I think, of men doing this work. I think of Hugo Schweizer. I think of Kyle Payne. These are men who have abused their positions of privilege. And we often talk about this being a brave thing for men to do this work. When actually it's a huge boon. We are elevated in the community. We are granted great social power. And the reality is some men use that power to divert resources from women's or feminist organizations, or use that power to hurt other people. And so, yeah, I think we ought to treat all men who do this work a little more skeptically also, which, I know is cynical, but based on my experience, a lot of men out there who again say the right things, I think are also doing great harm. Mm-hmm. And I guess related to that, right, we need I think feminist organizations and women's organizations to take men on and to hold men accountable who do this work. I think it's really important for men who do this work to do it under the umbrella of a feminist or a women's organization so that we can remain accountable to someone outside ourselves.
No, that was great.
I think it's really important to look at the men that are the consumers, the buyers, the perpetrators, and to know that they as well need some sort of support and some sort of healing. And that might be a good place to start with some work in the future, as well as, SACE has some great programming, Family Center as well. But to really address those individuals and maybe start trying to find ways to help those guys as well. I know I've had some wonderful conversations with some of those men. They hurt. They're just as fractured. They've had just as much pain. And we don't always address that part of it. And I think that's an important step for the future too, is to lend out a hand to those men as well.
Yeah, touching on themes from Derek and Cory, I think accountability, absolutely. I think, conversations around call out or calling culture get misconstrued when we're trying to use them as mechanisms of accountability. And accountability is really important because action and intent, not action, impact and intent are very different things, right? We can have really good intentions, but if our impact is harmful, we have to be honest about those things. And that's where accountability comes in, right? And I'm talking about accountability. I think being accountable to our mistakes, to how we've harmed people, it's also a process of healing. It's not just healing for the ones we've hurt ourselves individually, but allowing our communities to heal collectively together. So when thinking about, what do we want our futures, our communities to look like, I think having healing and accountability and really being realizing the trauma that we have all inherited from the roles that have been assigned to us, and working through that trauma through a pathway of healing. That's something that I really like to hold while moving forward in all of this.
I want to plug something. Is that cool?
Sure, go ahead.
So I run a podcast called the Modern Manhood Podcast. The whole reason why I do that podcast is to allow for males to talk about their own lives and talk about their own experience of being a man. I do get called out a lot because of just the name. As soon as they hear some people, not all of them, some people hear the name and assume something bad. They assume something, it's going to be like an MRA thing, or it's going to be something else, and they're like, why? And then as soon as they listen to it, they're like, oh, this is what this is about, and they're fine with it. So I'm conflicted about that. I'm not going to lie about that part of accountability. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I do agree that there are some people who abuse their power, 100%. I worry sometimes that when we have those good peoples, they're immediately always held accountable, even though I feel like sometimes they're trying to do a good thing, or they're trying to do something good. And I get, like, there are some people that do some terrible stuff or say some bad things. And I think those are the people that we definitely need to call out. But sometimes I worry when we go far in that accountability piece, then we won't be able to bring people that are good. I do agree that there are some people that are raised up to this stature, and just for saying the same thing, for instance, like a woman would say. Only a woman would say something, and this other man, and they're like, yeah, for sure, I agree with this person. But it's weird because someone else said the same thing. At that same time, though, like, in the terms of advocacy, like, I think people need to understand that, like, being a role model and being a male mentor is not, it's a hard, but it's a rewarding thing, but it's also not like, it doesn't take for you to, like, take 10 men and do a workshop or do something else. It just can take, like, one boy and just show them how to be a good person. And that's it. Like, if every person would do that, like, I think we would be in a better place. And I think it goes along for the work that we do here in the panel, and I think we do it all in a different way, and I think it's fantastic. And yeah, I think people just need to be empowered to actually just take one person and just say, you know what, we're going to do this together. and we're going to do this in a right way, in an empathetic way, and we're going to be vulnerable together, we're going to share our feelings, we might cry together, and that's totally cool. But if people are empowered to do that, then I think I struggle with that too. I'm just like, how do we empower people? How do we empower these people just to, it's not too hard of a job just to take one child and just help them out.
Yeah, to add to what Herman just said there, I think he summed it up really well, but I think there are touch points in boys' lives that are influential in ways that are beyond that touch point's understanding. So I think back to when I was a kid and I played hockey. My dad was always a coach. He'd show up to every game. And there was a boy that didn't have a father that was involved in his life, and his mother was too busy to attend games and kind of support him in that way. And my dad every morning would wake up and go pick him up for hockey. And he'd drive him to practice. He'd go out of his way to do this kind of little thing because he knew this guy needed a role model in his life. And thinking back to it, I think about the ways that that might have impacted that boy's life, and the way that those little moments that men can be role models in boys' lives are so significant. And when men are in like positions of power, or I guess power would be a word for it, but when you're a coach on a team, I don't think you're always cognitive of what impact that has on the boys that you're around. So the kind of language you use in those environments, the ways that you treat women around you, the ways that you interact with the world, these boys are seeing that and they're role modeling it. So I think it's about men kind of knowing that our actions do matter, and that when we're in these situations and we're doing good, people see that, and if we're doing bad, people see that as well. So it's about role modeling and being the kind of person that you would want your children or whoever to be. I also think there's, to go back, I think we do have to understand though that is a power that is kind of put on these men, and they're not maybe asking for it, but they have to understand that that is something that they have, and that they have control over, and that they can have impact on.
All right, well, if there's any questions in the audience, I think we have time for a few. There's a microphone in the center here. If anyone would like to ask either the whole panel or specific panelists anything that we haven't answered tonight. No? Oh, we got one question. Oh, is the microphone on?
I think that's a great question. When I do the workshops with young males, with young boys, I look at some of the data and some of the stats of what they use the most. For instance, in social media, for most of the time they play video games. You know what I mean? And I think that's what they're attracted to. For the most part, like when Justin was talking about feelings, I think you touched upon the different types of feelings that men are allowed to feel. When I do, it's funny, when I do adult co-facilitator for perpetrators of domestic violence, I ask them what kind of feelings that they're allowed to feel, or what feelings are there in the world? And the one they always miss out is fear. Most of the time, 90% of the time, they forget about fear because they're not allowed to express themselves, to be afraid, and to be vulnerable. I don't know if that's a specific masculine thing, and the only data I have is the stuff that I've done. So I can't tell you if that's obviously not a research or anything like that. But I know things like, for instance, like I harp upon video games a lot. You know, I show them videos like there's some stuff in Common Sense Media. There's some stuff surrounding why video games are targeted to males and what kind of messages that brings. I do some stuff around body image, for instance. There's some ads like body image does affect females a lot, but it does also affect males as well too. Like there's some ads out there. I remember one ad that was like David Beckham and half naked, and he was advertising milk. And I think males are objectified by other males. It's funny how we objectify people like Connor McDavid. And he is just, we don't really see that whole person. We just see him as an athlete, and he's a scorer goals, he's a savior of Edmonton, but we don't really see that man as a whole. But looking at sports, for instance, would be another one that I would probably touch upon too. So again, I don't know if that's all a masculinity thing, but those are the things I see the most. Is there anything you add?
I think it really depends on the conversations, the context. I'm not sure exactly how you're having these conversations with boys, but I think depending on your goals, you might want to think about, what are the behaviors you want to change. Something that I think is really important is the sharing of private images. That's a conversation that we need to have with boys, and how they need to not do that, and what to do if like a friend of theirs is sharing it. I've worked with co-ed groups. I've worked with groups of only female-identified people, girls. I've worked with groups of boys, and there's often a huge difference in the groups of girls versus the groups of boys. With the girls, they're really invested, but it's I've often noticed it more of it's like a somber attitude. I'm talking about violence, and this is like they know that this is their reality. With boys, it's often very more casual. They're joking around, maybe not taking it as seriously, but I think it's also having that conversation in a way that promotes allyship, right? That sees them as potential leaders and potential allies, and not as potential perpetrators. Even though we know the reality is that men are the perpetrators most often. I don't know, I feel like I have a lot to say, but a conversation might be better. So if you'd like to talk after, I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you. So when talking about gender at the Pride Center, we like to branch it off into two ways, and that there's gender identity and that there's gender expression. And I think the ways in which boys and men are expected to express their gender, or even if someone has certain interests or behaviors or mannerisms, those can be codified as masculine or feminine. And I think, society has its norms and will tell us and kind of define two, a binary between masculinity and femininity. And I think that if that is affirming for the young boys and men you're working with, I don't think that's a problem. But I think when they start perpetrating it blindly, and when they start enforcing that in others and not being critical about that, I think that's the caution I have around masculinity and around gender as well, is that, there's ways you can identify, and then there's how you express that. And that's why I'm cautious about answering this about what is masculinity, because that's a question that so many trans boys ask and that they try and answer, and a lot of them will buy into the expressions of it. But they don't think about their own malehood and what that identity means to them. And I think that's, some people will question that and some people won't. And I think having supportive environments that allow them to question that and be vulnerable is really important.
Any other responses? No? Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? No? Okay. Well, I think we'll end it there, and our panelists will be around for a little bit if you'd rather have a one-on-one conversation with them. So our panelists have been Justin Audison, Germán Villegas, Derek Warwick, Lynn Liu, and Cory Wyeth. So please help me to thank them with some applause. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, I'm running away with the mic.
Great. Thank you. Well, again, I found this to be a very deep and rich conversation, and it's actually almost hard to end it. So I hope that the challenge that we take away is to continue this in different ways. I would, a couple of things that I would like to see further exploration around in my part of the work is something that, Lynn, that you said, toxic masculinity can be a way to escape the racism that some men feel. And in my part of the work, it gives me great grief when I see the faces of many of the men who are the human traffickers, the pimps, and their faces are primarily dark-skinned. And I ask myself, what is their story? How did we fail as a community? What are they acting out? Now, again, when we work with the women whom they have harmed, we do have to seek for ways to hold them accountable. But I think I then ask, is jail the only answer? And what does that do to them? So I think that's a conversation I'd like to be part of. With respect to the buyers, again, CEASE facilitates the Prostitution Offender Program, which is for men who are caught for the first time soliciting for sex services, whether on the street or on the internet. And the whole purpose of that 8-hour program, first, is to inform and educate, and then to build empathy. Because we know that only through having empathy for another person do we change our attitudes and behaviors. So it's an option so that men aren't just given a fine or go to jail. They have an opportunity to learn. And I think often in that program, it's the first time that there's been conversation. We have a male psychologist and a male mental health worker, and we have a man who is in the self-help movement. And they're asking the guys, reflect. What was going on in your mind when you tried to make that contact? What was going on in your life? And I think it's really valuable in that way. I also, at the Prostitution Offender Program, we talk openly and honestly because we have a very high suicide rate among men in Alberta. And we need to crack that open and understand what is happening. And I like to say I'm really proud to live in Edmonton, where our city has men's groups and where there are peers who lead those men's groups. Life is hard. You don't have to carry this alone. There are people and men who care about you. Please explore those groups, as well as the many counseling options that we do have in the city. I'd really like to thank Dorian, who is our City of Edmonton liaison on the Sexual Exploitation Working Group, because she worked with each of you to pull this panel together. And I think that's, again, something to really celebrate in our city. All of us wonderful people. We all work together, and that's part of one of the great things of being an Edmontonian as well. I'd like to recognize, again, Reach Edmonton, Lisa, Brittany, and our wonderful 3 gentlemen at the back who are our webcasters. The good news you can spread is that you can go to the Edmonton SUG website and watch this conversation again, and you can promote that to other people who weren't able to be here tonight. So thanks to Reach Edmonton, kind of as our backbone organization, providing that great technical support. And once again, thanks to Gianmarco for joining us and for the thoughtfulness that you put into your questions, and to each of you as panelists for guiding us and keep the conversation going. Thank you.